What's up, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy, the official Ramco, and I wanted to talk about the low birth rates and blaming immigrants. So, and actually, it's going to be related to a comment on my last video I did about the Swedish school system. It was actually I think it was a woman who talked about how too much modernity or too much of this, like she compared it to East Asian countries, right? Where there's this hyper focus on career and high grades, but it has led to suicides, loneliness epidemic, etc. And I agree with her, actually. There has to be like a balance, right? But I'm going to get back to that, and it's related to the topic because I've heard from a lot of dissident parties on the right that we must deport at least 1 million people of immigrant backgrounds. And I listened to, for example, Gustav Kasselstrand from Alternative for Sweden, or AFS. And I actually agree with a lot of his stuff when it comes to globalism, when it comes to mass migration and stuff like that. And one thing that I also agree with is that he said that, for example, a Pakistani or Somali or an Arab or an Afghan would feel better in Afghanistan. Like they would feel more at home, right? And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think, there is a cultural clash that can be very harmful to a person. It doesn't even have to be, from quote unquote global south or third world countries, right? I've spoken to people from Southern Europe that have lived in Sweden or live here, and they just don't get the norms. They don't get the culture here, like the way people interact. They think it's weird, like this socially autistic country, you know what I mean? In fact, but I find it funny because if you just go across the ocean here, I live in Malmö. If you go to Copenhagen in Denmark, Danes are just the opposite of the way Swedish people are in terms of social interactions. I think that's interesting how that developed. I actually asked ChatGPT about that a long time ago. Again, I'm derailing here, but I think it's so fascinating that, and it said that Danes have a more, historically speaking, have had a more critical view of the church or something like that, the Protestant church. Hence, it's become like this, instead of being reserved and conformist, they have kind of become very loud and a little bit rebellious. Obviously, I can't compare them to the French, you know what I mean, or the Greeks. But still, there is a difference between Danes and Swedes, perhaps Danes and Norwegians. I haven't really been to Norway. I haven't really heard that much from Norway. It's a beautiful country, by the way, Norway. I think the nature there is stunning. And but yeah, the cities are kind of like Sweden, but the nature with the fjords, gorgeous country in that sense. But yes, what I would like to know, and this is a genuine question to all the, Swedish nationalists. And when I say Swedish nationalists, I'm not talking about Sweden Democrats, right? If you're a voter of the Sweden Democrats, maybe I can ask you. Because Swedes, there's a contradiction here. Swedes love their quote unquote independence, right? Like, to the point where it's like they take pride in being lonely, and but at the same time, they don't want immigrants here. And but there's an issue, because if you don't want immigrants, what are you going to do about the birth rates? That's what I want to ask. And all I'm saying is, you can't be mad at the immigrants. You can't be mad at Arabs. You can't be mad at Somalis because they have more stable family units in that sense. You know what I mean? In the sense of like having more more children and having more conservative values in that sense. Now you could argue that, okay, they produce a lot of children, but they don't necessarily take care of them. I think that could be a fair argument. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to say is your birth rates are collapsing. And on top of that, a lot of young white Swedish people, and white Swedish people generally speaking, they don't want to work in some fucking pizza place 12 hours a day. They don't want to work as delivery drivers. They don't, what I mean? They don't want to work as cleaners, what I mean? Like cleaning toilets and, schools and whatnot. Shit, I work with green space, within the green space upkeep, most of us are of immigrant descent, Middle Eastern or African or Yugoslavian background, or Afghans, etc. It's not a whole lot of white Swedish people working within that sector. So a large people within the service sector will disappear. In order to have an economy, somewhat like a capitalist economy, you need people to exploit, to just put it bluntly. You need that labor force. So I can't really see exactly why you're mad at the immigrants. Be mad at white women, liberal feminist ideology then, or neoliberalism. Neoliberalist economics is not exactly making things easier for promoting, stable family households, high birth rates. It doesn't have to be super high. I'm not expecting a country like Sweden to go back to the 1800s where a woman would birth like 9 kids or anything like that, but at least 2 to 4 kids. You know what I mean? How can you do that when a lot of the apartments and houses are designed for like 1 to 2 people? You know what I mean? And the large apartments are like super expensive, right? So that is kind of a dilemma that I just don't see how you're gonna fix without any radical reform or intervention. I remember Gustav Kasselstrand talked about limiting the abortion right? The amount of hatred and comments, I wouldn't say like outright hatred in terms of, well, I didn't read all of them, but a lot of them were saying like, this is a topic you shouldn't speak about, you have reprehensible views, etc. To me, it's like, word though, your race, your ethnicity, I would say, is disappearing. You don't think you need radical change, both culturally, economically, in order to make sure that Swedes as an ethnic group will survive? You know what I mean? I can't really see this because, again, immigrants are very dominant within the gig economy. You know what I mean? Also in the healthcare system, a lot of nurses, a lot of a lot of these nurses, they're immigrants. A lot of people that work within the elderly care, and you're gonna say, well, a lot of them can't speak Swedish, and they're okay. Fair enough. That I think that's legitimate criticism. But again, a lot of Swedish people don't want to work within that sector for whatever reason. Okay. So again, you praise your individualism so much to the point where it's like, it's harming your society. There is no collective nationalist loyalty in that sense, right? So that's kind of weird. And on top of that, I don't want to dive in too much into geopolitics, but sometimes the cultural stuff, the philosophical stuff, is related to geopolitics. You can't run away from it. Mass migration is a result a lot of times due to economic hardships and war. And Sweden, just like most of these Western European countries, are very much so allied within the Atlanticist NATO space. I disagree with Alternative for Sweden, or the Communist Party even, when they say that Sweden was neutral before. Sweden has, since the 1950s, never really been neutral. You can even argue World War II, because I think Sweden Radio, Sveriges Radio, actually made a documentary about this, how the CIA managed to turn the Swedish public into very pro-American people in that sense, right? The Swedish left became very anti-Chinese and very anti-Soviet, right? So there was this organization that the CIA created called the Congress for Cultural... Sorry, I lost the name. But they created this organization, and its ultimate goal was to create a liberal, anti-Soviet, and anti-Chinese left. Okay? It started with the hippie movement and, you know, promoting drug use, free sex, and all of this stuff. And, you know, that's why you see a lot of these leftists looking the way they do. You know, a lot of them are out of shape. They worship weakness. They worship, you know, degeneracy. You know, they just look awful. You know what I mean? They'd have horrible haircuts. They're overweight, or they're skinny as noodles. It's just being a weak person in Western leftist circles is something that they love. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I have never really joined any any communist movement or anarchist movement like that. I have opinions or views that can overlap with them. You know, I believe in economic justice. I'm against exploitation. But you know, I just don't get very inspired by these individuals. You know, I just hate that, you know, anti-masculinity, you know, anti strength type of stuff, which is weird, because if you study Soviet art, you would see that a lot of the men and the women there are actually portrayed in very good shape. You know, sports was very much so promoted, but yeah, that's a whole different topic. I love to derail, you know, talking about stuff, the history and stuff like that. But anyway, let's stick to the topic. So, my question is, what are you going to do about the falling birth rates? Because hating on immigrants is not our fault. that white liberal women don't want to have children. Okay, and then comes the question of interracial marriages, perhaps. That's a minuscule minority, and that's perhaps a topic we can talk about in a separate video. Race and dating. I think that's actually it's a touchy subject, but I think it's very important, because you know, I know a lot of commercials are pushing, let's say, black man, white woman, you know, type of stuff, or black woman, white man type of imagery, and I think that's kind of weird. Not because I'm against it per se, but if you're looking for a consumer base, that is a rare minority. Most people do not practice. I think it's called in the nice term miscegenation, right? Or interracial marriages. They don't. Most people are, you know, socialized into their own in-group, and they are comfortable. They want to go where they are comfortable. You know, where they know the norms, the jokes, the language, the food, and stuff like that. They don't want to trespass into unknown territory, and you know, there's gonna be a cultural clash every time about stuff like that. But my point trying to be is that the majority of white women do not prefer to be with you know, Middle Eastern men, or with African men, or Latinos, or Asians. They prefer to be with their own men, and statistically that makes sense, you know, from what I have just said, you know, and even on dating apps. And this is why I don't understand white incel dudes in a way. Some ways I can, in some ways I don't. But when it comes to because many of them are very racist, right? They hate non-white immigrants, they hate immigrants and stuff like that. From a racial perspective, you guys are, you know, the most popular on the dating apps, actually. Statistically speaking, white men are killing it on dating apps. So I can't really see why you're mad. Maybe you take bad photos, or I don't know. But because white Western men at least, they can afford to be, you know, individuals in that sense, right? If he's effeminate, he's in touch with his feminine side. If he's masculine, he's a cool bad boy. But let's say if you're a black guy, if you're a you know, aggressive dude, you're gonna be considered a thug, you know, and just a low life. Same if you're a Middle Eastern dude, you know, or you know what I mean. So, but the people who have it worse on dating apps, that statistically speaking has been unfortunately been Asian men and Indian guys and black women. But yeah, that's my 2 cents on that. Don't blame the immigrants, you know, blame the economic system, and, you know, blame white liberal feminist ideology. You can't be mad at us. If you like the video, you know, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and share it. I'll see you in the next one.